Thanks for the introduction. So tonight we're going to, they asked me to come and speak on user experience design. I don't know how much, I'm sure people have, there's a variety of knowledge here. And it can go pretty deep. There's some parts of it that's very subjective. Everyone kind of has their own process. It gets confused with user experience, user interaction design. It gets confused with web design. So the goal of tonight is to, what it says, it's an introduction. So we're just going to cover sort of an intro to user experience design, talk about some best practices, process, and some deliverables. So I'm Scott Stevenson, as Jody mentioned. I work at Extension Engine. Extension Engine actually is seated here, at least part of us, in the iLab. We're a mobile and software web app development company, and we have about 18 people that sit in the Northeast, and probably about 12 of them here. And then we have 100 developers who sit in a town called Split in Croatia, and that's where all of our development and production is done. And there's just some interior glamour shots of Extension Engine. So here's tonight's agenda. We'll talk. We'll define user experience. There's a lot of definitions out there, and so my goal for you guys is to at least start the process of distilling it and crystallizing it where it maybe makes a little more sense. There's something called the 5 planes of user experience, and we'll go through that with some associated examples and artifacts. I was at a client meeting, I don't know, about a year ago, and there was some of the CX level management was in the meeting, and we were talking about user experience, and they were, the CX level people were questioning, well, why do we have to do this experience part of the project? Why can't we just, skip over that and, get to the meat and potatoes? And so the takeaway there is that there's, in the corporate world, in many companies, there's they don't have a way to measure the value of user experience. So we'll talk a little bit about what the value is. We'll talk about process, some artifacts, what makes up a user experience team, and then just some interesting resources that I thought would be interesting for everyone. And then we'll have Q&A. So who gains the most from user experience design? So once again, kind of more like an introduction slide for you guys. Any teams that are building complex, rich experiences. So if you're just building a simple 15-page corporate, nice-looking website that's just more informational centric, it's probably not too heavy on the experience design. But if you're building a site that has some transactional properties, such as an Amazon, or maybe not that big, e-commerce, does something other than just offer up information in an aesthetically pleasing way. User experiences for the team that's working on that. They probably have a user experience on the team. Startups, and this may seem like an unlikely group that could benefit from user experience design, but as we all know, startups have less people and everyone has to wear more hats. And if you're given the choice, I know I would make the choice. If you're given the choice between a designer who's a good designer, competent, has a great portfolio, knows what they're doing, or a designer who actually has worked on some more experiential projects and sites, I would pick the latter. And it's like getting 2 people for the price of 1. So people who are entrepreneurial and starting up companies, they would do well in getting someone who has some user experience design. Maybe there's some people here, existing professionals who want to integrate or user experience into some of their projects or some process into their company, or want to find out a little bit more about it. I'm sure there's some people here. Any stakeholders involved in any applicable project that wants to learn techniques to make them work more effectively. So an example of that is Extension Engine has several clients where they're product clients, and we on a regular basis will do what we call a user experience bootcamp for them, where we'll have them in for a half a day or a day, and we'll actually go through tasks and deliverables and workshops and card sorting and all the other sort of interactions that go with user experience design, so that they understand the process, they understand best practices, and that their interactions with us as we move toward a new product are just that much more efficient. So what is user experience? So everyone, I Googled this just so that I can make this point. If you type that in, you'll get, there's not enough hours in the year to go through them all, but everyone has slightly different definition of what user experience is. And what Extension Engine views user experience is it's when the goals of a user align with the goals of a business. And that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a good user experience. It could be a crappy user experience. Think of your grandmother's VCR. No one still knows how to program them, so that's a bad user experience. But a positive user experience is when the goals of the user and the goals of the organization that are creating the product are met. If they're not met, then either the users don't understand what their goals are, what they should do, and vice versa. So I like to put every analogy into some sort of a mathematical equation. So here we go. So business goals plus user goals plus user interface plus technology equals user experience. In the UX world, there's a process and artifact that's well known by everyone called the 5 planes of UX, and it's a way to start to break down the basic steps of how to develop a UX, into sort of a cohesive framework. So I always find the chart, and it's the same chart everywhere, and I always find it kind of it's not very client friendly, but hopefully the way we break it down will make sense. So there's 5 planes to in the user experience process. There's working from the bottom toward the top. There's strategy, and we'll go through each of these in a moment. There's strategy, there's scope, structure, skeleton, and surface. And going from abstract to concrete probably doesn't mean much now, but it will once we get through this. So those are the 5 steps that are used to help break down the developing a user experience, and each one has associated tasks and deliverables. And so let's go through that. And we'll come back to that in a second. So I thought just for a contextual example to use while describing these steps, I thought I would use Amazon. I think it's safe to assume that everyone knows Amazon. So in the strategy phase, it's really about it's what we were talking about before, business goals and user goals. So it's about what's the reason for the site. It's like the big question. What's the purpose? Why are we here? What are we creating? Why are we creating it? What are the goals? So in this case, we can pretend that it's Amazon is 20 years ago talking about this. It's this part of the this first plane strategy where we're starting to define what the users want, what the businesses want, or the product. And I think, so as we're developing the big goal and the purpose for whatever we're creating, and as we're starting to define what the users want and define what the businesses want, we're trying to create that, the beginning of aligning the business goals with the user goals. So I think in this case, it's safe to assume in the Amazon example that users want to purchase books. I know they can purchase a lot more, but it's a hypothetical example. And that Amazon wants to sell books and sell more books and sell more stuff. So so this is a good example of distilling down what the goals of the user and what the goals of the business or the product happens to be. Next, we move on to the second plane, which is called scope. And scope is really the migration of the strategy that we talked about earlier here into what we call requirements. So now that we've figured out what the purpose of this particular site or product is, we've figured out what the main goals of the user are. We've figured out what the main goals of the site or the product are. Now we need to start work on requirements. So it's getting a little bit less abstract and a little bit more tactical. So in this phase, we're developing tasking user stories. So what a user story? It's a UX term, but what it really means is, if we're all here developing a site like Amazon, what do we want the users to be able to accomplish on the site? What are all the things we want them to be able to do? Knowing the users, and it's really, it's very important to really, this process is not to just go through a process, it's to really identify the users and develop the right tasks. Knowing them and providing the right tasks will directly, affect profit. And not knowing them and or not providing, the right tasks, and we'll get into exactly what tasks are, will directly affect profit and thus the user experience. So I thought with each of these, I define them and then just go into a simple example. So this is an artifact of a user story matrix, and so this is where we would define all the different types of users, talk a little bit about their personas. So it could be college students, it could be business people, it could be gift givers. There's a bunch of different users in the case of Amazon, and so this is where we start to analyze and annotate different users and what tasks they should be doing. So let's, a simple user story is we can assume that users, in this case, want to search for books. So these are just some tasks. Read about and compare books. View books, recommendations. we've all done this, save to a wish list, get shipping estimates, purchase using credit and debit card. And I know it's very elementary, it's very simple, and there's probably enough tasks to wallpaper the room as well. But so this is how the user stories start to begin, and the tasks that we want users to be able to do. So if we don't nail these tasks, another one we could add in there is make checkout in as few clicks as possible. If we develop these tasks and we don't pay these tasks off in the next steps to come, then the user experience starts to fall apart. Third step, or the third plane, is called structure, and this is where things start to get a little bit more, a little less abstract and a little bit more tactical. This is where we start to develop the taxonomy. So we've developed the big goal, in this case for Amazon, is users want to buy books and Amazon wants to sell books. We talked about the different types of users and their tasks, what we want the users to be able to do on the site, and now that we've agreed on that, we need to actually start to blow out this taxonomy here of where do things live, what sections are there, what are we calling it? So how do all the pieces start to fit together and behave? How do the users find what they're looking for in an intuitive way? What's the flow of actions and interactions throughout the site? So starting to just come up with silos and taxonomies of alike type information and what's bucketed under that, and how do people traverse from one area to another. So and there's many other documents that are part of the structure phase. This is just a simple sitemap. So structure artifacts. Some other artifacts in the structure phase are what you just saw as a sitemap. There's something called mind maps, which are maps that are less about content and more about trying to make a roadmap of particular users and the experiences that they want to encounter. There's flow maps. In this case, this is a very simple flow map. So get on a computer, go to Amazon, search for the book. Is it in stock? Yes. Click add to cart. No. Go somewhere else. So for any kind of rich sites, especially e-commerce sites, it's something we call it the buy flow. So it's a particular flow. There's particular doors that we want users to come in. There's particular behaviors we want them to exhibit at certain points on the site. We want to corral and flow them a certain way to the point where they can check out and their book will be shipped to them. And remember, this is all part of mapping. Amazon has sold the book, and the user has just hopefully easily purchased the book. So once again, another artifact that's just ensuring that the initial user experience that we defined is getting paid off. The fourth plane is called skeleton, believe it or not. And this is where, what we've just done before this is created a taxonomy, and we've created buckets and groupings of content and where things live, and some sort of user flows about how people are going to find the information that they want. And once we've nailed that down, then we go on to the skeleton phase, where it's about actually starting to create, think about, it's a blueprint. We're trying to, knowing what we want them to do, now we have to create the pages and the information and put it in the right place so that when they're traversing, they find exactly what they need on pages. So we call this a wireframe. So, it starts to answer questions, very simple things. What elements are on a page, and these aren't labeled, but, there's some promos here. It looks like there's a video here. There's all these little things here, little calls to action that, buy now or learn more, things like that. So where do the buttons go? How much copy is there? What types of call to actions are there? So as I said earlier, wireframes are a blueprint for the site pages and the site for the site. I'm sorry, and anyone who's in the industry knows as well that when we're showing this artifact to a client, we purposely don't put any color, any logos, any real type. They're like this, and even this confuses many clients because they think that that's a proposed color palette of two tones of gray. So we keep design completely out of it. Because if you did put a color there, you'll 9 times out of 10 you'll side rail the meeting, and you'll definitely pick the color that the client hates the most, and they won't be able to get off that. So what we want people to do here is to concentrate on what content's on the page, what's the relative hierarchy as compared to other pieces of content, what are the calls to action, how big are things, where's the button go, things like that. And so in the skeleton phase, there's like the other phases, there's many artifacts. So there's what we call lo-fi artifacts or lo-fi wireframes. So it means exactly what you think it means. It means that they're not hi-fi. They're not high fidelity. They're low fidelity. So this is an example of a low fidelity wireframe. It's a hand sketch. It's actually a nice hand sketch, but it's a hand sketch. It's static. Doesn't do much except just show the particular content for that page. So anything that's static or hand sketched would fall into lo-fi, and hi-fi would be if you actually made this clickable. If you actually coded it up in CSS and did simple little HTML wireframes that look just like that, but they were actually interactive. Those would be examples of hi-fi deliverables and artifacts. My favorite phase is the surface phase, because that means you're almost done with the project and you're ready for the next one. So the surface phase, this is where all the everything is built up to this point. So you have what the goals are, what the user's goals are, what the business or the product's goals are, the user flows, the taxonomy, the page requirements, what's going to be on the page, what's going to be a button, how big is it going to be. And then this is where you actually put the design veneer on top of it. So this is where the design starts to come in. So it's a visual interface tier that ties all the other components together. So this sits on top of that wireframe that you just saw. This is where all these other disciplines have been off, working in parallel with you, but the content person's been off developing the content for the site. The designers have been off working on all the design elements of the site. If your company is large enough and you have a color anthropologist, maybe they're off working on colors, developing what typefaces, what's going to be HTML, what's going to be a graphic. The brand person has talked about, what the brand or the personality of the site should be. In this case, it's a very utility-driven site that's clean. And then, of course, what images go on there, where are the buttons, how big are the buttons. So this is where all the graphical veneer goodness comes together. So just, a simple example, it goes from skeleton to surface. And that's actually, this is a current Amazon site. And the wireframe behind it is a current wireframe as of midday a couple days ago. So as I mentioned, it's getting easier and easier to sell in user experience components into projects because I don't know, maybe Apple has something to do with that. I think the majority of people understand that that good experiences actually matter. They help brand and they increase profits. And but even when we go into client presentations, we don't show this deck, but we have a couple of pages that talk about ways to think about how to measure and how to validate user experience, just to make sure that they understand the value. So a good user experience will positively affect how people feel about site or product, and that leads to increased sales and conversions. And of course, hopefully no one will debate hard with me on that. Some of this is sort of assumption centric, just to get the point across. Increase repeat visits to the site and encourage it to others. I think all of us in the room, whenever we find either a quirky kind of a cool site, or we've had a good experience shopping or whatever, we're always emailing or Facebooking it or telling our friends, hey, check out the site. It was a good experience. And then one other thing that a lot of people don't think about, and it obviously depends on the particular project and client, is that a good site can reduce support costs. So I think the Apple site actually, I was trying to figure out before the presentation how to the slides that were looping, and I couldn't figure it out. So I had a bad user experience with Keynote. This is on Apple's Keynote. But when I went to Apple site and went to the support section, I had a good user experience because it said you're an idiot, just click on this button and they'll loop, and it did. So that I don't think I would have called Apple and asked them, but joke intended. It's just that good user experience and can actually generate higher customer satisfaction and lower support costs. If you have an issue with Comcast or RCN or those types of places, and I don't think they have very good user experiences, but if they did, they could probably get rid of half of the people that take those calls every day. So I put together just 2 pages, 2 different sites of just to sort of give you an example, at least through my lens, a good user experience and a bad user experience. So yellowpages.com, this is their previous site. This is not the one that's up now. This was up about 9 months ago, and I actually used it a couple of times as well. And I read online that the goal for this particular iteration of the site was to be a utility for quickly finding information in as few clicks as possible. So somewhere in one of the earlier UX steps that we were discussing, someone presumably was sitting around a table and said, hey, we want a site that, we just want it to be, a tool that's easy to use, let people get numbers in as few clicks as possible. And I thought it did a good job. It's very utility driven, right? It even has some, it exposes a lot of information that you don't have to dig for. Simple tabs to get to tools and popular categories and find and locate. And it's very, it's a tool. And I thought they did a good job. And then when they redesigned it, this is the current site, and the designer in me says it's a pretty site. It has a nice grid, everyone likes squares. The images look nice. It's colorful. Looks like there's a lot going on. So in that case, I think not knowing the goals, I think it worked. I think it's a beautiful site. But knowing the goals, I think it's actually starting to step on them a little bit. Up in the main nav that we just looked at earlier, they had something called more tools and search tips, which they removed on this redesign. Why, I don't know. And then they have these images, which it does like an IP detect and or will ask you where you're located, and so it peppers these ads and that they're making revenue off of that are locality based that come up. And while they look good, I think they start to at least distract me from quickly in as few clicks as possible finding the number. Debatable, but I think they based upon that goal, I think they went backwards. Based upon no goals, aesthetically it looks nice. And then the second experience that I thought would be interesting to call out is, does anyone know who Square is? Do people know? Yeah. So they're a digital payment app, and actually Toscanini's over in Central Square, unfortunately, is one of the few places around here that maybe they've expanded in the last month, but they actually use Square there. And what's that? Oh, they use Square? Oh, beautiful. I didn't know that. So this was their original site about a year ago. And it rotated through automatically, or you could click in these different sections, and it still doesn't look like any other site. I think it's a really high production value, gorgeous site. But their goal, like many apps, is it's all about conversion. You can find any information you want anywhere you want, but the goal of the site is to sign up users. That's the only goal for this site. So the goal is to convert new users, both businesses and consumers. And based upon knowing what that goal is, I find this site, takes sort of the long path to that. It's things are rotating. You have to wait till you get to the right slide that has, interesting content on it that will make you click. Here, it's about learning more, so it's more exploratory. And I never quite thought that what I know the goals of the site to be aligned with the actual user experience. But in their current site, which is up right now, I think. The goal is absolutely aligned, right? You come here, it's start accepting credit cards today. It doesn't get any simpler than that. Sign up, get a free card reader. They practically did it for you. There's nothing else to do, and they do it in a nice, clean, impactful way. And then up above, which I think is brilliant, is that they quickly vet users. So whoever the user is, they can see, oh, Square Wallet. Well, that's me. I'm a consumer. Square Register. Well, that's someone who. Like Toscanini's or the B2B play who's interested in that option. So they don't even have to say, hey, consumers click here, businesses click there. You just know. And you can do everything that they want you to do from this one page. So I think that's a user experience that went in the up direction, positive direction. So these are all the UX processes. This is 5 minutes of. So when I typed in UX process, this is what I got. And I actually had 3 times as many in there, but it was slowing the presentation down, so I took them out. But that doesn't matter. The takeaway is that everyone has a process, and everyone's is different. And I think the reason that they're different is you're going to have a slightly different process if you're creating a physical product, like an iPhone. So if you're creating an iPhone, a physical product experience, your process may be a little bit different, a little bit tweaked to creating a physical product. If you're creating digital experiences like mobile apps and websites, your process will be slightly different. If you're creating, there's people who create experiences for when they create a new building or they put up a new wing to an airport. There's people who do experiences of just what does it feel like to walk through there? Do you intuitively know where to go? There's service experience companies who design experiences around customer service. How do people answer? If you call into some support line, how do they answer? What do they say? How do they quickly get the problem out of you and get you to the next person? So there's all kinds of different experiences. So I think that's one reason for why the processes and the charts that you see for the processes are all a little bit different. I also think every individual agency kind of has their own take on it. it's a little subjective. There's a little bit of gray area there. Agencies and companies also like to prioritize things. They go into a client and they say, hey, with our 5-step process, we'll get you to market in, no time at all. And so they may actually, call the different sections of the process different things to make it more proprietary and more sort of their own. What someone might call a research phase, someone else might call an analyze phase. So this is our process at Extension Engine. So we have 5 phases. We have, you can read it for yourself: research, strategy, implement, deploy, and then measure, optimize. And each one of these, each phase of this process, there is an associated list of tasks that we actually do, and associated deliverables for those tasks. And the deck will be provided. I don't need to read every single little line, but basically in the research phase, that's what we were talking about earlier with the 5 planes of UX, and that's where we go in. We're seeing what the client's been doing. We'll do like an audit of competitive analysis. We'll interview some of their current users. We'll do some thinking about the different types of users. It's where we're kind of ramping up and trying to figure out get all of our sort of strategy and goal information packaged up so that we can get the client to agree on that and then move on to the next phase. And then in the strategy phase, we're assuming we get approval from the research phase, we're developing UX strategy. We're doing some working sessions with the client to kind of ideate what we're going to do, what the product should do. We're doing user flows and stories that we talked about earlier. We're developing personas. Who are the different users who are going to be using this? Are they single white female, 18 to 27, drives a Jetta and works, makes this much money and drinks 2 Starbucks coffees a day. So we're trying to really get to know what the users are in the strategy phase. We go into the implement phase, and that's where it gets a little more tactical. We're doing visual design. We're doing information architecture, some storyboarding. That's where a significant portion of the development takes place. And then this deploy phase where we're, it might actually be the final product, or it might just be a quick iteration. But we're ready to release and do some testing, do some interviews, see how people are liking it, some usability testing, and then almost like everything that we do, we'll measure and optimize. So what did the usability testing show? 9 out of 10 people didn't know how to get past the splash screen. Hopefully not. People complained of this. People were stuck on that. People really love this, and they really got that. So it's both the good and the bad. And then we'll talk about next steps. We'll iterate and make changes, and then redeploy. So that's in a nutshell, that's our process. And these are some of the UX deliverables and artifacts. These may be some terms that you heard. Some things that we discussed tonight. So there's a lot of artifacts associated with it. Design, reports, documentation, optimization, creative strategies, page flows, personas, user flows. So these are just I thought it'd be nice to just provide, and I still think there's a few more we can put on there, but just a list of artifacts and documents that we use in order to traverse through the user experience process so that we can get to a user experience where the businesses and the users' goals are met. So depending on the firm or company that's doing the user experience, if they're as I touched on earlier, if they're a small shop, the person who is the information architect might also be the visual designer. If they're a larger shop, they might actually have each of these would be a separate person or a separate discipline. And if they're if they're a 50+ shop, these would actually be departments. But generally speaking, in the UX world, the team is comprised of an experience director. So I play that role quite often, and that's someone who works with the team in creating user experiences. So as a director, I spend a lot of my time client-facing. So I still push pixels so I can keep it fresh, but I spend a lot of my time client-facing, talking about business strategies, and then converting those business strategies into user experience solutions, or working with my team to convert them. There's people who are thinking about nothing except what the content is for a particular initiative. There's visual designers who are different than experience designers. The experienced people are thinking about what's the experience, who is the user, how are they going to flow through a particular experience. What are the tasks, what do we want them to do. The visual designers are more sort of screws and bolts. They're developing the color palettes. They're developing all the elements and the buttons and the graphical veneer that goes over the experience. There's information architects who are putting together the taxonomies the user flows and any of the sort of fancy schematics that you see. There's front-end developers who are working on anything that the user sees, they've coded or developed. So they're the people who are working in whatever they need to work in, HTML, HTML5, JavaScript, Ajax, any kind of front-end programming language. There's, if it's an e-commerce site, there's obviously a back-end component to it too, right? There's the transactional properties, there's the purchase engine, there's the inventory and the database. So, if it's a site like that, then there would also be what we call a back-end developer who's building all the stuff that the user doesn't see, but that funnels up or pipes up through the front-end design. Usability specialist, so that's someone whose job is to think about what's the usability of the site, and they'll use a variety of diagrams or tools and artifacts to rate how a user, how the usability of the site is. Is it easy to, they'll set up sort of initiatives or tasks to do on the site, like go and buy a book, and they might use some, they might use a lab where they're actually with a moderator and they're actually running people through these tasks to see how they do. They might do like retina tracking to see where people are looking on the site. So they're just, all they're concerned about is how do people, is the site usable, and if not, what are the issues, so that we can go back and iterate and hopefully make it usable. And then user testing moderator. So we, on some of our larger initiatives, we'll do user testing. Sometimes that's, we'll give people a $25 Starbucks gift card and have them come in and sit down, and we'll give them sort of tasks to do. And other times we might use the lab at Bentley, who has a great usability lab, and we'll record the session. We'll have a moderator. It's like two-way glass, and once again we'll give them tasks to do, and then they'll do the tasks, and then we'll have a debrief with them, asking why they did this, why didn't they do that, so that we can really figure out where usability is excelling and where it's lacking. So that's a typical UX team. And there's a lot of resources out there. These are some that I used a couple of these just to sort of confirm some stats that I had, and these are others that I go to as well to to sync up with either processes that are going on or other people in the industry. And that's it. So, questions? Yeah. So the question was tips or tricks on how to best convert people, right? I haven't spent a lot of time on. Actually, I spent a lot of time on Groupon in a 24-hour period. But I guess one tip is that people, even myself, want to naturally just put everything about their company on the front page. This is our name. Here's our huge logo, and this is what we do, and here's our value. Like, they want to just load the front page with tons of stuff. And in fact, it depends on the company. But if it's a company that's about getting users, because users, equals like valuation, and they may have to get their second round of funding or what have you. And if they have like 500,000 users, that looks a lot better than if you have like 2,500 users. So, trying to take some of that off the site so that they can just figure out what, just have the site function as it's supposed to function, but still having what we call paths or ways for the user to migrate to other content if they want to find out like about the company, if they want to find out more about why they might have a unique value proposition. So, and that's really hard to do. I mean, and actually to the earlier lady's question about like a contractor, contractor versus a company, depending on the contractor, they may not have the wherewithal to push back on someone. They might just be more in the do it mode. The company says, this is what we want, and they're like, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And whereas a company, because we're using best practices and we've, you can assume we're seasoned, we're known for, especially me, pushing back on clients. And not, you have to be a jerk about it. You just present strategy why they wouldn't want to do that. We just finished with a client who's doing it's like a wellness site. You log in and you can track what you eat and how much exercise, and it comes up with charts and things like that. And they came to us and they had, the site was actually fairly nice looking, but they had a whole block of copy, and they said, no, this has to be here. This has to be here. They wouldn't know what we do if it wasn't here. And it took a little hand holding, but we got that off, and we actually just had, sign up now for, yada, yada. Want to know what it is? Learn more. And then, so people could go that way. I also think, having the right graphical elements. I think, if it's about converting people or getting people to buy something, I don't think you want a bunch of different buttons. You don't want to confuse the user. We think about it as like a path. And so when the user comes here, we want the user, do we want to buy a book, or do we want them to find out more about the company? Because they're two different things. Buying a book will be, we'll use a button, even down to like an arrow, that feels like an e-commerce arrow. I don't know if you go home and check it out, look at different sites. Arrows that are about finding more information on a company versus an arrow or a button that's about purchasing something, they feel completely different. To me, they're like night and day. So even down to like the sort of the psychographics behind like a button and how big the button is and what does the arrow look like. So I think it comes down to strategically what information to be on the page or not on the page, and also the elements that you use, because believe it or not, we're all trained to like recognize these sort of cognitively without even thinking about it. But that's a couple of ways. How do I measure user experience? Well, there's several ways you can measure it. You can measure it based upon user adoption. So if you put something out there and assuming it's actually out in the public, if people adopt it and people are using it, that could be like downloads or signups, or if it's an app, downloads. So user adoption is one metric. If no one's using it, then it's a low measurement. You can do focus groups to find out, and asking questions such as, does this, this site is about, kind of like I did up there, this site is about being a utility toward yada, yada, yada. Does it feel like that or not? No, it doesn't. Why not? And, get those answers from them. You ask that, 25, 30 people, and you add it up, and then you might start to see some patterns. And, everyone said, hey, the value promise doesn't map to the homepage or the site design. Why not? Because I didn't see a next button, or I didn't get this paid off. So you can do focus groups to measure. You can do follow user adoption. You can do everyone knows you can do Google Analytics and see how people come into your site. How long do they stay there? What page did they go to? What's the drop-off rate? So there's different ways to measure. For site mapping and user flows, there's a lot of products out there. I use one called MindJet, and it's a great product. They have like new release every year, and it's really, really easy to use. And you can make you can make a site map for United Airlines. I've done it just as an exercise, and it's the size of this screen at 10-point type. It's huge, but you can make that in like 2 hours. So MindJet for that. Camtasia is we don't really. I guess I don't think about that as being a user experience software. That's a software where a lot of people on YouTube use it. It's where you can record what you're doing on your screen. So you can be like, hey, tonight I'm gonna, show you how to make a kite, and go through the steps, and you can record whatever is on your screen, and people will post that to YouTube. So I don't think about that as a user experience, but like card sorting or like card scenarios, and IDEO is a famous user experience agency, and they actually sell those cards. And they also have an app for $5 that you can buy as well. But I bought the physical cards. Balsamiq actually lets you create wireframes. So those would be hi-fi prototypes. And on their screen, on their homepage, they show samples of the wireframes in using like a font called Lemonade, which looks like a kid's font. And just actually what I said earlier, it didn't feel professional enough to put in front of a client, but that was just a crappy template that someone made a bad judgment call on to use on the homepage, because when I looked at their templates, they had really nice templates. So Balsamiq we like Balsamiq a lot. So it's a program that lets you, drag components of a wireframe. Maybe it's a big box, or a headshot, or a movie. Just those gray boxes that we looked at earlier. It lets you drag them onto a page, and make multiple pages, and you can link those pages to each other. So it's like a hi-fi wireframe tool that you can use. I like that quite a bit. Only the most savvy clients really know who their users are. A lot of them. One of the mistakes is they think they know who the users are, and what they confuse is what they think their experience should be with what a user's experience should be, right? So they're thinking from their footsteps instead of their user's footsteps. If you're creating a, some sort of rich site, the discovery phase, or the research, the analyzer research, even I call it multiple things, that's typically about 6 weeks. And that builds in time for multiple reviews. That builds in time for us if we have to do interviews. It builds in, gives them a few days to actually understand what we're presenting back to them and actually think about it. So that process is typically 5 to 6 weeks. And if it's a simple little site or project, it might be like 3 to 4 weeks, but typically it's 5 to 6 weeks. And the other processes could go out, the one that I was talking about earlier, that went out a year. But a typical sort of site that has some back-end functionality, some data analytics, it actually does something, is typically 3 to 4.5 month project, assuming there's no blockers and it's not like a gigantic initiative. He wants to know how teams that are doing agile design, commingle with teams that are doing the regular process. So agile design is, we saw the UX process and we assume that we're building it could be a mobile app, it could be a website, and it takes a certain amount of time and there's a certain amount of phases. So agile, what they call agile design is it's almost like a mini process within the overall process where there's instead of waiting for that whole 3 months to test and see how see if things are going to go well. Hopefully they will, because we have a nice process and we're using best practices and we have artifacts all to hopefully ensure that. But there arises sometimes where we'll do something called agile design or agile process, which is while the longer process is going on, in the middle there might be let me see if I can just call it up here. So this is 4 to 6 weeks, and this is depending on the project, several more weeks. And so there's like upfront research, there's some strategy deliverables and artifacts. This is where the rubber meets the road, and you're starting to get less abstract, more concrete. You're actually starting to put some designs together. This is where you do testing, and then this is where it goes out, and then you kind of measure, see how things are going, and then maybe come back in and do some of these phases over again. So agile design is if you want to do quick multiple iterations of a product before it gets to this point. So right in here, as we're going along, we may have there's different ways to slice and dice this, but we may have UX people and designers who are just business as usual, working along, going keeping their they're on the runway, just going down. But we may have a separate designer or a separate team of designers who are and we just did this on a project 6 months ago where we'll quickly mock up like something that's less polished and more rough, a particular page or a particular interaction, and we actually may test that with some users. So we may actually do surveys or have a quick focus group or post it for friends and family, to see like, hey, listen, here we'll just use the example. Here's the start screen or a home page or a checkout page. We'll develop it and quickly iterate a design, and we'll actually test it right in here. And we'll get quick feedback, and we'll make those changes. And actually, I did that at Lycos. We were remember them? They had a whole business furniture section, and we would quickly mock up these screens to show like a thumbnail, a desk, and buy now, and more information. And then they have a lab there, so we'd go into the lab, and they'd bring people in for lunch, give them $25 and give them lunch, and we'd say, hey, listen, go buy a desk, and we test it out. And they either would or wouldn't. We'd analyze the path that they did, and we'd ask them questions. And then after that, we'd get together and say, hey, listen, 9 out of 10 people didn't even see this button. Like, how much bigger can it be? Well, maybe it's not the button issue. Maybe it's in the wrong part of the page. So we go back literally that same day, and we'd start moving components around, and tweaking the design. Very next day, we'd have more people come in for lunch. We'd see if that helped improve the task. So we do this for like 2 weeks, every other day for 2 weeks, until people loved it. Meanwhile, the sort of long, the other team is going along with business as usual. They're doing the rest of the design, and then eventually, whenever we're testing this sort of these artifacts from this agile process, we'll catch up with the other people and actually implement that. You want to know how this changes if we're doing mobile? Yeah. It actually doesn't change that much. I mean, when we're doing we might call storyboarding. We might call that something different. Or instead of doing, some of the terms may change, but the foundation of the exercise and the tasks that we're doing are pretty much the same. We may call them something different. We use the same process almost for whatever we develop. We may call them slightly different things internally. We may not do we may not do storyboarding for certain mobile apps, either due to scope or whatever the particular app is. But for the most part, it's really, I mean, if you break it down, it's doing the upfront research, it's developing, who the users are, how they're gonna traverse through there, doing development. There may be other sort of prongs off of development, right? So there may be development with the Android iOS, there may be with the Apple iOS, instead of we probably don't use information architecture. We don't call it that a lot with mobile apps. We don't think about it as far as like those types of pages. We still call them wireframes, but we think more about sort of screen flows. So I'd say for the most part, the process stays as is. Flipboard, I think, was the first to the mat. And the interesting thing about Flipboard is that in doing that product, they created these navigational paradigms that never existed, right? So, I mean, forget the flipping. The flipping actually is nice. I mean, but that's been around since Flash, 4.0. Flip pages. But the way that you go throughout there, where you'll it'll be the integration of social media and other stories, and you would click on something, and the page would slide over, and then if you want more details, the page would slide up, and then if you wanted more details, then it would say, I think it says linking to outer page, and then that goes away, the other page goes down, you go back, and just the way that they're they're going to like a quaternary level of information, and I think a really organized, intuitive, simple way. I mean, I spent hours looking at Flipboard. Google's actually not bad, but I think it's interesting that you brought it up, because I think that Flipboard, they had to figure it out. They were like, all right, how do we get to quaternary or even 5 levels of information drilling down without it just being like a mess? And the way that the screens move and how screens tier up on other screens, and keeping that really simple back to home on the top left. I think they did a great job, and now you're seeing that everywhere. So that, and also, I know this wasn't part of your question, but Pinterest also has a really, is it Pinterest or is it Path? Pinterest, where it's a mobile app, and many mobile apps that you'll see have like those icons at the bottom that say settings and more, and I don't know, reload my card or whatever it says along the bottom. But Pinterest took all of that and they put it into just a single little button in the top left that holds all that information. And now you're starting to see that. I saw it in an application called Path, and I think some version of AOL Instant Messenger app that I saw uses it. So now everyone, you click it and they all like kind of come out in an arc. And so, it's always nice to see, those are like the true leaders, it's nice to see those new paradigms. All right. Well, I could either do puppet shows or I could say thank you. So, thanks.
There we go. Let's talk about strategy. In 2009, the CEO of the Hyatt hotel chain decided that he wanted to try something different. He had been gotten beaten up by his shareholders because their satisfaction ratings had fallen dramatically. So he decided he was going to try something, a program he called Random Acts of Generosity. The idea was inspired by a story he'd read on the internet, talking about how people were doing things such as when they would go through a toll booth on the highway, they would not only pay for themselves, but randomly pay for people behind them as a random act of kindness. And he thought that this would actually delight people to get random acts of generosity. So the way this worked was he instructed all of the staff of all the Hyatt hotels to just randomly do nice things. They would randomly do things like pay for room service, or the bar tab, or some sort of massage, or an upgrade. And the idea was that by just randomly picking a customer and doing this random thing every so often, it would delight the customer so much that they would tell all their friends and they'd be all excited about it. What he didn't do, the problems that were causing the satisfaction to drop, he didn't fix the fact that the hotel was not working functionally for many of the guests. Air conditioning was broken, the room service was sloppy, elevators were often very slow and not working. Their banquet services would mistakenly serve frozen pies instead of thawed out ones at their events. There would be broken glass for days without being picked up in public areas. These were the things that were causing the satisfaction ratings to drop. And he thought, well, maybe if we just paid people off with these random acts of generosity, we could boost the satisfaction. But it didn't work. Not only did it not work, we can predict why it didn't work. It turns out that we can map the experience that a customer has. What we do is we put this on a scale where we lay out all the things that the customer has to do with us, all of what we call the touch points that a customer has with our business, whether online or in person. And we can rate those moments on a scale of extreme frustration to extreme delight. And we can actually map out the entire journey of that path, going from extreme frustration to extreme delight. So, for example, we might have a great experience on the website looking for the hotel, but actually looking at the property description, we may not be able to tell if it's the right hotel or not for us, so that's frustrating. And then maybe once we decide we're going to stay there, the actual process of booking works great, but then when we go to pay, we keep getting error messages about having dashes in our phone numbers and not putting in the right security code for our credit card and all sorts of crazy stuff like that, and that's frustrating. So we can map out the frustrating moments and the delightful moments. And this turns out to be one of the most useful tools we have, because from this we can decide what we want to do differently. We can focus on those bits that are most frustrating and work to improve those. Now, for a long time, there are many of us who've worked in the field of usability or human factors. And where we started was in this idea of saying, okay, there are all these frustrating experiences out there. Let's unfrustrate them. Let's make them not frustrating anymore. And the process of doing that allowed us to work our way up. And now we've gotten good at this, and we can think in terms of delighting our customers, delighting our users, delighting our employees. Turns out that delightful employees make for delightful customers, so we want to do that too. But it's interesting that we have this scale that goes from frustration to delight, because there's actually this sort of awkward space in the middle. And when we started in that world of usability and human factors, that awkward space in the middle was, in fact, usable experiences. And usable experiences basically are not delightful, but they're not frustrating. To get from frustrating to usable, the methods we used was just to remove all the frustrating bits. Basically, try not to suck. That was the method. But to get from usable to delightful, we have to do something different. We actually have to be delightful. And knowing what that means, knowing what it takes to get there, that turns out to be really difficult, because it turns out that not sucky is not the same as delightful. They are not the same worlds. When we're trying to make something not suck, what we do is we just pull out the frustration. It's like how Michelangelo would make a sculpture. He would carve away the rock that shouldn't be there. But delightful is an additive process. We have to add something to what we're doing to make something delightful. And this is where it gets tricky to build a strategy. To do that, we have to sort of think about what strategy means. And we can, in its simplest form, decide that the strategy that we're going to have is about moving our users from this idea of frustration to delight. But to do that, in any given project that we work on, there are all sorts of questions that we have to get answers to. We first have to figure out what it is we need to build. We then need to figure out where the resources we're going to build that are going to come from. It's important that we figure out how to say no to what we're doing. We have to figure out how we're going to tell if we've done a good job. We need to understand how we're going to make things different than what our competitors are building. We need to understand where we're going to add value and build something even better than what we have today. And of course, the almighty cost question. How much is all of this going to cost us? So any sort of strategy has to take some notion of an investment. We have to decide that we're going to spend money, spend resources in order to get a return. And so if we go back to this idea of delighters and frustrators, how much does it take to get rid of the frustrators, and how much will it cost to increase the delighters? And this turns out to be an easier question to answer than we thought. And the person who figured that out was this dude, Noriaki Kano. And he came up with a model that explained what it means to make a good investment towards getting customer satisfaction. What kind of investment does one make? And he represented this, when he was doing his work, as a two-dimensional model. So on the vertical axis, he put satisfaction, going from frustration to delight. On the horizontal axis, he said, okay, we're going to map investment, going from a small investment to a high investment. And he started to plot out organizations and companies that were good at producing delightful things and organizations that weren't, to see what was happening. And what he found was that there were basically three patterns. The first one is something that he called the performance payoff. And the performance payoff is basically a straight investment of, we put more money in, we get more results out. But then he found that there was another one, which had to do with basic expectations. basic expectations actually start with a fairly high amount of investment and just go up from there. But they don't actually produce much in the way of satisfaction. They can get rid of frustration, but that's it. And then the third one is excitement generators. Excitement generators are where the delightfulness comes from. So let's dive into these a little deeper. Let's start with the performance payoff. When Apple comes out with a new operating system, one of the things they love to do is tout how many features they've put into it. They do this by just sheer number. Number seems to be the important thing here. Right? The fact that they've updated all these apps with all these features is what they're selling you. TextEdit has new features. I'm sure this has made your day. You can't wait for the new features in TextEdit. And that's how they think. They think in terms of just putting out more features, because the more features you got, the better it's got to be. And this is a process we see all the time. Startup comes up with this little app. Maybe it's got 3 things it does. And it's a success. Everybody loves it. This thing is flying off the virtual shelf. Now, they say, okay, we need to get people to pay us to upgrade. So what do? Well, we'll add a couple more features. People keep asking for stuff, so we'll add them in. Sure enough, still successful. Now we've got ourselves an even better show. Then they say, okay, let's try that again. Put in a few more features. People keep coming to them saying, we want this. And slowly, over time, the number of features that we keep adding start to increase, start to go there. People are coming in. Companies are coming in. They're putting big bags of money on the conference table and saying, we will buy hundreds of these, thousands of these, if you keep adding features to this. And so all of a sudden, we are swimming in features with every new release. And here's the problem. All those features mean that we have to have a user interface with menu items and buttons and links and other elements that make all of this stuff more complicated. When we were just 3 features, it was easy. And when we were just 3 features, we could take our time and design something that just worked. But now that all these people coming in and asking us to build things, and we're just taking those big bags of money and we're just saying, okay, we're going to build this thing. Even if there's only one company that's ever going to use this feature, we'll build it for you. We create options. We create elements. And every time we do that, we create complexity. This is experience rot. Experience rot is what happens when we increase features, which cause us to increase complexity and thereby degrade the experience. Suddenly, we've got all of these features that we're dealing with, and users are not able to use the application. Someone who's new comes in, can't figure out the simplest things to do. And it creates havoc. And this is expensive. This is design debt. Now, we have all these features. How can we fix this? Well, here's what the smart companies do. The smart companies decide to go out and study their users. They watch what they do. And what they learn is that most of their users, the great majority of them, have only figured out how to use a few of the features in the app. So what the smart companies do is take that research and they throw everything else away and they prune the product down to just those features. Now, every time I give this presentation, someone comes up to me and says, well, at my company, we could never do that. Once a feature goes into the product, it is there until every employee dies. Right? It can never come out again. That's just the rules. And I tell them I'm completely okay with that. I understand why they do that. That makes perfect sense to me. And I don't care. I don't care because if they're not going to do that, there's someone else who will. This is called disruption in California. And this is basically how it works. All competitors come in figuring out that someone else has built this big bloated thing, figure out what the 3 or 4 or 5 things that the customers actually use are, put out a product that's easy to use, that's well thought out, that has everything integrated, and only those things, and the vast majority of customers will switch. Boom. That's the competitive way to do it. So how do you prevent this problem? Well, the way companies are doing it now is with a simple 2-letter word. No. Which I believe is the same in French, right? No, it's not. It turns out that the most important thing that a team can do to help their design is to say no to almost any idea for a feature. And if you look at the products that have the best experiences, what you see is a team of people who've gotten really good at no. The analysts, everybody will come up with ideas, tell them what should be in their thing, and they come out with a product that doesn't do that. It's very simple, it does what it's supposed to do, and that's how it works. And they fight every new feature request because that's how you keep it. Curation is the trick. So that's how we deal with that performance payoff. We make sure we highly curate our designs. That takes care of one of the curves. But let's talk about expectations. So we're staying at this hotel over by the Louvre. And one of the things that's amazing about this particular hotel is when we got into our room, and it's a beautiful room, we got into our room, there was this door that went to another room. And in that other room was the coolest stuff. There was a sink and a shower and a toilet. It's amazing. You have everything in France. And that's the thing, right? That doesn't surprise you that that room is there. But here's the deal. 100 years ago, many of the hotel rooms in the city did not have that. And it wasn't common for those little rooms inside the rooms to have all those things. And so that shower turns out to be an expectation. Not only do I have this expectation that there's a shower, I expect this shower to have warm water, hot water, when I turn it on. Within seconds, I turn it on and I expect hot water to come out. I don't know where this expectation comes from, because when I'm at home, I have a 2-story house, and I turn on the water, it can take 5 minutes for the water to get hot. But in a hotel room, I expect hot water right away, right? Now, imagine a Hyatt hotel, a 32-story Hyatt hotel. Do you know what it takes to get hot water to every room within a second? It turns out what they have to do is they have to put circulators and hot water heaters all the way through the structure. So the water is constantly moving and constantly being warmed, even at 3 a.m. when it's unlikely anybody is taking a shower. So to get the water hot, they have to actually pump it all the way up and pump it all the way down and constantly heat it. That's a lot of money that Hyatt spends in order to make that water instantly hot, which is the basic expectation. And the thing about basic expectations is you don't get to pick what they are. The hotel website never mentions that every room has a bathroom. That promise was never made. Yet, if I went to that hotel and it didn't have one, I would be completely disappointed, completely frustrated. I might even go check into another hotel. So, they didn't set that expectation. Somebody else set that expectation, yet they have to meet that expectation, and that's how expectations work. You have to meet them, even if you didn't set them. Sometimes it's not even clear who set them. Sometimes it's your history that set them. Netflix, when it was in the United States, when it first started, was all about DVDs. In the mail, you would get DVDs of movies. And one of the things that made Netflix amazing was the wide selection of movies you could get. So you would take all these movies and you'd put them in your queue and you'd have them send them to you and they'd sit on your table for 3 months and then you'd watch them. And that was the Netflix experience. And it was fine, it was great, it was wonderful. And people loved that they could not just get the big blockbuster movies, but they could get little movies that were art films or things they'd never heard of. When Netflix moved to streaming, things had changed for them. When they were in the DVD business, the movie industry paid no attention to them. They thought they were unimportant. So they were able to buy all these DVDs cheap. And it was no big deal. But by the time they moved to streaming, it turns out that the movie industry had decided to come out of its coma and noticed that they existed. And once they did that, they said, well, we're not going to let you stream our movies cheap. We want a bigger cut. And they insisted on bigger contracts. So Netflix, trying to protect its assets, said, no, we're not going to sign for bigger contracts. So they just said no. And as a result, they ended up not getting a lot of movies. The problem was that their customers didn't understand the contractual problems that Netflix was having with their distributors and the movie industry. They didn't understand the licensing fee problems. So they couldn't understand why some movies would be, let's say this Bill Murray film, would be available for Netflix, but this Bill Murray film would not be available for Netflix. They had no idea how to do this. And it turns out that now the experience of using Netflix is you sit down on a Saturday night and you spend about 2 hours trying to come up with a movie that they actually stream that you actually want to watch. Well, what about this? No. What about this? No. And so they have this basic expectation that they set themselves that they would have all this catalog, all of this content, and suddenly it's not there. It's not available. And this is a very frustrating thing for customers. This is a map of a little part of Ireland called Airfield, Ireland. And one of the interesting things about Airfield, Ireland, the most notable things about this little village just to the east of Dublin, is that in Airfield, Ireland, there is not a single airfield. At least there wasn't until Apple Maps iOS 6 came out. Because in iOS 6 Apple Maps, suddenly the icon for an airfield appeared in Airfield, Ireland. Probably a machine learning problem. And everybody thought this was really funny. Everybody except for the Irish Federal Aviation Administration, who didn't think it was funny at all, because they, being the people they are, had this scenario in their head that some pilot would have a massive engine failure, be in a real distress mode, reach into their pocket, pull out their Apple device, and look for the nearest airfield, only to be told that was a place called Airfield, Ireland, for which they would then try and make an emergency landing in some place that doesn't have an airfield. And this scared them. Now here's the thing. Apple's iOS 6 Maps application was the best map application of its time. It was by far the most advanced one. It was the first first online map system that worked completely well for people who are blind. It had sonic cues that would tell you whether you were walking in the right direction or not. It would read off street names as you passed them. It was a fantastic tool for people who had no vision. Great features. But the problem was the data. You may remember some of the problems with iOS 6 maps, like this post-apocalyptic view of New York City Central Park, or the dipping of the Hoover Dam, the redestruction of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, the flattening of the Eiffel Tower, or my personal favorite, the discovery of the Swedish Burger King. While the app was a great app, the data was not up to par, and therefore it did not meet the basic expectations, and this was the problem. The thing about basic expectations is that they actually take a fair amount of investment. You have to spend a lot of money to make sure you meet those basic expectations. It costs a lot of money to get the map data right. It costs a lot of money to get the water hot throughout the hotel. And you can try and cut those costs, but that will induce frustration. Of course it makes sense for the New Orleans Hyatt to shut off the hot water at 3 in the morning, because who would possibly want to take a shower at 3 in the morning? It couldn't possibly be someone who had a 6 a.m. international flight and has to get to the airport 2 hours early. They certainly wouldn't want to have a shower between 3 and 4. So that frustrates. But the thing is this. You can fix the frustration, but you can never make anyone happy, because the best you can do is neutral satisfaction. No one's going around saying, wow, that toilet in my hotel room, it's amazing. You only have to flush it once. Right? No one says these things. When it doesn't work, we talk about it. When it works, we ignore it. It's invisible. So we can only screw up. That's the thing about basic expectations. We have to get them right, but we only find out when we get them wrong. So we constantly have to do research to understand what are the basic expectations that are being set, that we have set, that others have set, and how do we bring that through. So this is our journey map. And as you can see, it's got peaks and valleys. Things we did well, and things we didn't do so well. But what if we took the team and we did a little exercise where we just said, what would the customer's experience be like if we took all the valleys and made them equal to the peaks? Basically, make it all delightful. This is basically what we need to do with excitement generators. We push up past the frustration point, that's meeting the basic expectations, then we go and make things delightful. It turns out that one of the people who spoke here earlier today, Dana Chisnell, figured out that there were, if you didn't go to her talk this morning, it was absolutely amazing. You should have been there. She figured out that there are 3 approaches to delight. She calls them pleasure, flow, and meaning. So let's take apart Dana's little model here and start with pleasure. There's 2 guys at the University of Michigan who did this interesting project called the Significant Objects Project. And what they did was they went out to eBay and they bought junk, like this little statue of some Russian dude on a piece of wood. Fortunately, being that they're professors, they didn't have to spend a lot of their salary on it. It cost them $3. What they did next was the interesting part. They went out and found friends who were writers and asked them to write stories about the objects that they created. For example, one of their writer friends created this story about the figurine of Saint Vladimir and went on to describe how this was a family heirloom that the current owner who was on eBay had in their possession that was given to them by their grandmother, who was given to them by their grandmother, that was completely convinced that this was a good luck charm because it had saved their grandmother's village from burning down during the pogroms. And the story just went on and on about all the good luck things that happened to them because they had this little statue and all the bad things that happened to their neighbors because they didn't have the statue, and went on to describe all of this wonderful stuff. Fantastic story. The professors took their friend's story and took the figurine and put them both back up on eBay to try and sell it as if the story was true. And it worked. And they sold it for $193.50. Now, the only difference between the statue they bought and what they sold was the story. The story makes all the difference. Well, it turns out that this happens a lot. We do studies of how people shop online, and we watch people shop for things like cameras. And the way that we watch people shop for things like cameras is we find people who need cameras, and we bring them into our labs, and we actually give them the money to buy the cameras. And what's fascinating about this is that we've noticed some patterns about the way the companies that sell the things like cameras sell them. For example, Walmart.com, they have a product description for every camera, but the product description is completely different from camera to camera because all the Walmart.com people do is they copy and paste whatever the manufacturer gives them. It makes sense, right? If you're going to sell thousands of items, you're not going to spend a lot of time crafting anything for it. Instead, the manufacturer's already done all the hard work. You just take what they said and you put it there. They know their product better than you. Put it out there. But one of the sites we studied was a little different. That site's called Crutchfield. And Crutchfield sells the same cameras that Walmart sells. But they don't copy and paste the manufacturer's description. In fact, they completely ignore the manufacturer's description. Instead, what they do is they hire people in their customer service department who love the products they use. They hire photographers, and they hire audio files, and they hire people who just love those products. And they bring them in to work in customer service. And then instead of using the manufacturer's description, they give the product they're thinking of selling to those employees. And those employees do things like make videos about what they love about the product and what they don't like about the product. And they write these massive database tables that allows them to actually list everything that every camera does so you can compare one camera to another easily. And they create these long, long product research dockets that have every little detail about what the camera can and can't do, including what comes in the box. Every detail is there. And what they've done is they've added all that in. Now, in our studies, the way they work is we find people who need to buy a product. They're ready to buy it. And we actually give them, as their payment for the study, the money to make the purchase. We figure out how much the product they want to buy is, and we give them that much money plus a little bit, just as a budget. And that's what they have. They can buy the product, they can not buy the product. And it turns out that when people buy things at a site like Walmart, they spend about 89% of the money that we give them. But when they were at Crutchfield, they spent more than that. Not only did they spend 100% of the money we gave them, they spent an additional 137% of their own money to buy the product. And the only difference between the Crutchfield product and the Walmart product was the story. The story provided delight. And it was actually at very low expense for a very high return. So it turns out that that's the pleasure part of this model. Let's talk about flow. In the United States, you can buy automobile insurance. This pays for you in case of an accident. And traditionally, online automobile insurance folks, when they first came out, they stuck with their call center model. So they would ask you lots of questions. It would take, on average, 20 minutes to fill out a form to be able to actually apply for insurance, only to discover at the end of the 20 minutes that you weren't qualified to get it. And this was a very frustrating thing. And the main reason that you were not qualified was that you did not live someplace where they offered the insurance. So when Progressive started offering online, they decided they were going to do it differently. So the first thing they do is they ask you for your postal code and immediately tell you whether they sell in that postal code or not. Seems like a brain-dead simple thing. Nobody else had thought to do this before them. But they took it further. The next thing they do is they ask you for your name and your mailing address and your date of birth, and that's pretty much it. Because at that point, they can now go look up in the registry of motor vehicles. They can look up your data and figure out what cars you have. So unlike the other insurance companies, which make you put in all sorts of information about the cars, they just ask you to pick which cars that you already own you want to insure. And since they know the make and model of those cars, they can automatically fill out all the equipment that it has, something that the other insurance companies always asked you for. And what they were able to do was, in 6 screens and less than 5 minutes, give you a complete quote. And that turns out to be delightful, being able to get a complete quote in less than 5 minutes. with only 6 screens of interaction. And that's flow. The last piece of this is meaning. And meaning is a little bit more complicated to get your head around. A car rental agency started in the United States called Zipcar. And Zipcar is absolutely amazing because instead of renting cars by the day, you rent them by the hour. You fill out an application, you get it approved, you put your card information in, and now you can just get a card for when you need to go to a doctor's appointment or for when you need to go pick up some heavy things at a store. You can get the car just for the time you need it. You don't have to own a car. They pay for the gas, they pay for the insurance, they pay for everything. The cars are often parked within blocks of where you live. And that's the key thing. Because they're parked within blocks from where you live, and you just go and pick it up. You drive it. When you're done with it, if the gas is a little low, it's your responsibility to fill it up for the next person. Hopefully the last person filled it up for you. And they've created these communities around the cars. Zipcar has neighborhood parties. And everybody who rents the cars come to those parties and they get to meet each other. And on their badges at the party, not only do they have their name, but they have the name of the car they rent. So you can meet all the people who also love your car. And now you know the people who leave it a little dirty or don't fill up the gas like they're supposed to. And guess what? You're more likely to put the gas in the car. But they do other things, like at Christmas time. They'll let you rent the car for free if you'll deliver toys to families that normally would not be able to afford those things. Or on election day, you can rent the car at half price if you'll pick somebody up and take them to vote who can't get to the polls otherwise. So they're creating all of this community-based elements to their program. And this resonates with their customers. And people tell us that they love Zipcar because of that. Now, creating meaning is hard. It's the most expensive, most difficult thing you can do. And it's really complicated because you have to work really, really hard to make this all be functional. The thing about creating meaning is you have to believe it, and the customer has to believe it. United, for example, it's an airline in the United States that tries very hard to piss every passenger off as much as they can. The effort they go to is mind-blowing. But every so often, they'll try to convince you that they actually are doing the right thing. And the way they do that is they'll run an advertisement that talks about how they are taking care of the Olympic athletes, flying them across, and that's their idea of meaning. The customers don't buy it because the customers see the Olympic athletes getting this great treatment in their little ads, but they don't see themselves getting that great treatment. It's not authentic. They're not treating their customers authentically. So meaning has to be authentic. So this is Dana's model, this idea of pleasure, flow, and meaning that is critical to success. This is the hardest part, getting the excitement generators right. If you can do that, you will succeed, but you have to get the basic expectations. You have to get the features right. Then you can start to work on delight. That was the problem that the CEO of Hyatt had. It wasn't that people didn't want to get the occasional bar tab paid for. They needed the water to be hot in the shower and the toilet to work and there not to be glass on the floor. That's what they needed. And the thing about excitement generators, the thing about delighters, is that things that are delightful today will be basic expectations tomorrow. 6, 7 years ago, if I were to go to a hotel and it had Wi-Fi, that was amazing. If I go to a hotel and it doesn't have Wi-Fi today, that's not acceptable. Right? It's gotten to the point that I want Wi-Fi on every flight I take. For some reason, when I'm in the clouds, I need to get to all my things in the cloud. So I need to have Wi-Fi in the flight. That's a basic expectation. It came out of nowhere. It came in less than a few years that it's now a basic expectation. And it needs to not be crazy-ass expensive. It has to be cheap or free, because I already paid a lot of money for this service. So that's the basic expectations. They go from delighters to basic expectations, and you have to be careful about that. So I want to talk about one more thing, because it's this word that everybody keeps using here. I don't think it means what you think it means. It's innovation. We can map the current experience of the customer. We can figure out what we want the experience to be, what we would call our aspirational experience, what we aspire to be. The space between that current experience and that aspirational experience, that is where innovation comes from. That is where we innovate. And the way we innovate is best by taking those most frustrating bits and improving them. So in the United States, taxes are a fairly complex thing. Nobody looks forward to it. But a company named Intuit came up with a solution called SnapTax, which is very simple. You take a picture of a form, the form that your employer gives you, and it scans the picture of the form. All the information that goes into your taxes, if you don't have very complicated taxes, all that information is actually on that form. If you have multiple employers, which people in those income brackets that use this thing do, you can scan each one of those forms. They'll scan it, add it up, show you your tax form filled out, ask you if you agree that everything is correct, and then if you say yes, it will actually file it electronically for you and get your refund. For the 48% of Americans for which all the information they need is actually on their forms, taxes are done in under 15 minutes. That's delightful. And that's innovative. But here's the thing about innovation. Every conference I go to talks about innovation. And the thing is that people think that innovation is about inventing new things, coming up with something that nobody had before. But here's the thing. Intuit did not invent the camera. They did not invent optical scanning. They did not invent electronic filing. They did not invent any aspect of that app. All they did was take things that already existed in the world, put them together, and added value because they added value to something that didn't exist before. That's real innovation. So innovation is about adding value. So if we want to be innovative, we need to focus on the basic expectations that our customers and users have and start to explore where we can add pleasure, flow, and meaning to be able to bring value out to them. That's what I came to talk to you about. Thank you.